300 years ago, a single name was written into the Salem records, Tituba, and then it disappears. No last name, no birthplace, no grave, just one entry, a confession, and then silence. That silence is the part that should bother you. Because Tituba didn't just confess to witchcraft in February of 1692. She described a conspiracy, and parts of what she said were removed from the official record, not misplaced, not damaged, removed. For over 2 centuries, historians claimed those missing pages were lost. They weren't, they were edited. And if those edits hadn't happened, Salem might not be remembered as a story of hysteria. It might be remembered as something else entirely. This isn't just a story about superstition, it's a story about power, about how fear can be shaped, directed, weaponized, and about how an enslaved woman, with no rights, no protection, and nothing left to lose, briefly held more influence than anyone in Salem. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, the Salem Witch Trials won't look like chaos. They'll look engineered. Salem Village in late 1691 looked peaceful from the outside. Neat wooden houses clustered around a meeting house. Stone walls dividing rocky farmland. Smoke curling into a grey winter sky. But underneath that quiet surface, the village was fracturing. It had only been its own parish for 15 years, separated from wealthier Salem town, where merchant ships brought in money the farmers could only imagine. Salem Village had land, but not much prosperity. The soil was thin, winters were brutal, and to the north King William's War raged on. French and indigenous forces attacked frontier settlements. Refugees poured south with stories of homes burned in the night. The enemy, people whispered, could be anywhere, could be anyone. Fear of invisible threats settled over the village, long before anyone mentioned witches. And inside Salem itself, another battle was brewing. The Western farmers, led by the Putnam family, believed they were building a godly independent community. The Eastern landowners, closer to Salem town's merchant class, wanted commercial growth and influence. It wasn't just about land, it was about identity, and the battlefield for that conflict was the church. In 15 years, the congregation had driven away 3 ministers, arguments over salary, over authority, over who controlled the parsonage. Then in 1689, Reverend Samuel Parris arrived. He was supposed to bring stability. Instead, he brought tension. Parris had not always been a minister. He had been a failed merchant in Barbados, born in London, partially educated at Harvard, never graduated. His father left him a sugar plantation in the Caribbean, and Parris mismanaged it into bankruptcy. When trade collapsed, he turned to the ministry, and when he moved to Salem Village, he brought something else with him. 2 enslaved people from Barbados, John and Tituba. Almost nothing is recorded about Tituba before Salem. We don't know exactly where she was born. We don't know her real age. We don't know what language she first spoke. In Salem, she was simply called the Indian woman, property, invisible, except when useful. But within the Parris household, she was not insignificant. She managed the domestic work, cared for the children, handled household responsibilities, while Parris's wife Elizabeth struggled with recurring illness. She had access to rooms, to conversations, to documents, and that closeness sparked rumors. Some whispered she had been more than a servant in Barbados. There's no proof of that. But in a small village already divided, rumors were fuel. Parris himself did nothing to calm them. His sermons grew darker by the month. He preached of invisible enemies, of Satan building a kingdom in the wilderness, of demons walking among neighbors in human form. He divided the world into 2 categories, the saved and the damned, and in his view, the damned far outnumbered the saved. The Putnam family embraced him. Their rivals did not. By the winter of 1691, Salem Village was tense, bitter and suspicious. And inside the parsonage, something else was beginning. Winter that year came early. Snow piled high. Travel slowed. The village grew isolated. Inside the Parris home, the minister's daughter Betty, 9 years old, and his orphaned niece Abigail Williams, 11, had little to do. Betty was anxious, deeply affected by her father's sermons about sin and damnation. Abigail was sharper, observant, calculating, aware of her precarious place in the household. And one night, as the fire burned low, they asked Tituba for stories. At first she resisted. Her role was to serve, not to entertain, not to speak. But eventually she began. She told them about Barbados, about heat so intense New England summers felt mild by comparison, about bright birds and sugar fields stretching to the horizon, about cultures layered together, African, indigenous, European, in ways Salem had never seen. The girls leaned closer. They had never traveled, never seen anything beyond their rigid, narrow world. They begged for more, and Tituba told them about obeah, about reading signs in eggs dropped into water, about herbs that could heal or harm, about forces beyond what ministers described in sermons. For a few hours at a time, she was no longer invisible. She was the center of attention, the keeper of knowledge, and in a world where she had none, that small power mattered. But in Puritan New England, knowledge from the Caribbean was dangerous. Herbs practiced by English women were medicine. Herbs taught by a dark-skinned enslaved woman were witchcraft. Reverend Parris began to notice the change in his daughter. The whispering, the secrecy. He listened from above, watched through cracks in the floor. What he heard disturbed him. And then Betty began to scream. It started at night, shrieking from her bed. Convulsions, claims of seeing figures in the shadows. She froze mid-sentence during the day, complained of invisible needles piercing her skin, tried to throw herself into the fire. The village doctor examined her. No fever, no illness, no physical cause. His diagnosis would ignite everything. The evil hand is upon her. Witchcraft. Within days, Abigail began to show the same symptoms. Then Ann Putnam. Then others. The fits spread with terrifying consistency. And now the village had what it feared most. Proof that the invisible enemy was already inside their homes. But here's the part that matters. For weeks the girls refused to name their tormentors, until pressure built, until the community demanded answers, until fear needed direction. And when the names finally came, they were not random, they were chosen, and one of them was Tituba. That's when she understood something critical. Denial would not save her, confession might. And when she stood in the meeting house in March 1692, chains on her wrists, she made the most important decision of her life. She would give them exactly what they wanted, not just a witch, a conspiracy. And from that moment on, Salem would no longer be driven by fear alone. It would be driven by narrative, one she helped create, and one she would not survive untouched. When Parris turned to ministry, it was less a calling than a last resort. The Puritan Church in Massachusetts was perpetually short of educated ministers willing to serve in rural parishes, and his partial Harvard education was enough to qualify him. He was officially ordained in November 1689, and brought with him his wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, his orphan niece Abigail Williams, and his 2 enslaved people. From the very beginning, his ministry was contentious. He preached sermons about invisible enemies and conspiracies against the righteous. He told his congregation that Satan had established a kingdom in the wilderness, surrounding them, that demons walked among them disguised as neighbors and friends. His worldview was fundamentally paranoid, dividing all people into the saved and the damned, with the damned far outnumbering the saved. The Putnam family became his strongest supporters, seeing in him an ally against the Salem town faction. The Porter family and their allies withheld portions of his salary and challenged his right to own the parsonage. By late 1691, with his position growing increasingly precarious, Parris's sermons grew darker, more desperate, more obsessed with hidden enemies. It was into this poisonous atmosphere that Tituba disappeared each night, climbing the narrow stairs to the unheated attic room she shared with John. She was perhaps 30 years old, though no one had ever asked. Her skin marked her as different, in a community that prided itself on English purity. Whether she was African, indigenous, or mixed, was debated in whispers. Some claimed she was a Carib from the islands. Others said she was African by way of Barbados. Still others insisted she had Spanish or Portuguese blood. The truth was that no one knew, and no one cared enough to ask. She was simply the Indian woman, or Parris's slave, her identity reduced entirely to her status. The transition to Massachusetts must have been devastating. From tropical heat to New England winter, from a plantation with dozens of other enslaved people, to isolation in a hostile village, from a place where her knowledge of herbs and healing was valued, to one where such knowledge was viewed with deep suspicion, she worked from dawn until long after dark, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, caring for Betty and Abigail, spinning, weaving, making soap and candles, all the endless labor that kept a colonial household functioning. Parris paid her nothing. She was property, not a person. But he also depended on her completely, because his wife Elizabeth was often bedridden with ailments that were never clearly diagnosed. Without Tituba, the household would have collapsed. In the kitchen where she spent most of her hours, there was a particular stone in the hearth that had cracked from repeated heating and cooling. The pattern resembled a bird in flight, wings spread wide. She would stare at that crack sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Those who noticed thought she was simple-minded, prone to daydreaming. They had no idea she was calculating, waiting, because Tituba, as events would prove, was anything but simple-minded. The other person who spent significant time in the Parris household was Abigail Williams, Parris's niece. She was 11 years old in the winter of 1691 to 1692, orphaned under circumstances never clearly explained. Parris had taken her in out of family obligation, but treated her more as a servant than a daughter. Abigail was a sharp, observant child, with a talent for reading people. She understood the tensions in the household, her uncle's resentment, her aunt's chronic illness, the whispered arguments about money. She also understood that her own position was precarious. An orphaned girl with no property and no prospects had few options in colonial Massachusetts. She would likely be bound out as a servant to whatever family would take her. This anxiety made Abigail hyper-aware of power dynamics. She watched how her uncle wielded authority through his sermons, how certain families commanded respect while others were dismissed. She noticed that accusations carried weight, that reputation could be destroyed by whispers. She was learning lessons that would soon prove catastrophic. Betty Parris, 9 years old and the minister's daughter, was a different creature entirely, fragile, anxious, prone to nightmares. Her father's sermons terrified her. He preached about children born in sin, about the devil seeking young souls, about the torments awaiting the damned. Betty took these warnings literally, lying awake at night convinced that demons waited in the shadows. The complex dynamic between Betty and Abigail, one the privileged daughter, the other the dependent orphan, would become crucial as events unfolded. The winter of 1691 to 1692 came early and stayed late. By January, snow lay 3 feet deep in places. The wood supply in many homes ran dangerously low, and the Parris household suffered along with the rest. The minister's salary was perpetually in arrears. The isolation was profound. In summer, children could play outside, and women could visit neighbors. But winter locked everyone indoors, sometimes for days when storms made travel impossible. The Parris household was particularly isolated because of the minister's conflicts with much of his congregation. The girls had few friends, little entertainment, and endless empty hours to fill. It was Abigail who first asked Tituba to tell them stories. The enslaved woman resisted at first. Her place was to work silently, to be invisible despite her visible difference. But Abigail was persistent. On a January evening, when Reverend Parris was visiting a parishioner, and Miss Parris lay ill in bed, Tituba sat with the 2 girls by the dying fire, and began to speak. She told them about Barbados, the impossible heat that made New England summer feel cool, plants that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in gray Massachusetts, birds that could mimic human voices so perfectly you couldn't tell them from people. She described sugar plantations, where hundreds of enslaved people worked fields stretching to the horizon, and the songs they sang to make the labor bearable. The girls were entranced. They had never traveled beyond Salem and its immediate surroundings. The world Tituba described was exotic, almost unimaginable. They begged for more, and Tituba obliged. Night after night, when circumstances allowed, she told them about the different peoples of Barbados, Africans from various kingdoms, indigenous people from the mainland, Europeans from England and Spain and Portugal and Holland, all mixed together in ways impossible in Puritan New England. And then, because the girls begged for something frightening, she told them about the Obeah practitioners she had known, people who could read the future in eggs and water, who knew which plants could cure and which could kill, who understood that the world held forces the English ministers never mentioned in their sermons. She shouldn't have. She knew even as the words left her mouth that she was making a terrible mistake, but there was power in being listened to, in seeing these privileged girls lean forward with wide eyes, hanging on her every word. For a few stolen hours, Tituba was not invisible. She was the center of attention, the keeper of knowledge, the one with power. It was intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. The sessions continued, always in secret. Tituba taught them small tricks, how to crack an egg into a glass of water and interpret the shapes the white made as it dispersed, how to listen to the wind in the chimney and distinguish natural sounds from something more. She showed them herbs from her carefully tended corner of the garden, explained their properties: pennyroyal for women's complaints, tansy for fever, foxglove for the heart, though it could kill if the dose was wrong. It was innocent knowledge, the kind every woman carried in the Caribbean, the kind that kept people alive in a world without proper doctors. But in Puritan New England, it was something else entirely. The knowledge of herbs was acceptable when practiced by English goodwives who had learned from their mothers. When it came from a dark-skinned woman from the Caribbean, it became suspect. It smacked of heathen practices, of folk magic the church condemned as devil worship. Tituba must have known this. She had lived in Massachusetts long enough to understand how differently her knowledge was perceived here. But she continued the sessions anyway, perhaps because the risk seemed small compared to those few hours when she was treated as something other than property. Anne Putnam, 12 years old and daughter of the powerful Thomas Putnam, heard about the sessions from Abigail. She demanded to be included and brought with her several other girls: Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, who lived with the village doctor; Mary Walcott, 16, from another prominent family; Mercy Lewis, 19, a servant in the Putnam household, who had survived an Indian raid that killed her parents. The circle expanded to 8 or 9 girls, ranging in age from 9 to 19. They gathered in the Parris kitchen on late January afternoon, ostensibly for prayer and needlework, but really to listen to Tituba describe a world so different from their frozen, restricted existence that it might as well have been another planet. For these girls it was thrilling. Their lives were severely constrained by Puritan expectations: no dancing, no singing except psalms, no games, no frivolity. Their futures were predetermined: marriage, childbearing, household labor, early death. The knowledge Tituba offered suggested other possibilities, other ways of having agency in a world that offered them none. What none of them knew was that Reverend Parris had noticed the change in his daughter. He began to spy on his own household, listening at doors, watching through cracks in the floorboards from the room above. What he heard alarmed him. Tituba speaking about practices he recognized as witchcraft, his daughter and niece participating eagerly, other girls from the village involved. This was exactly the kind of corruption he had warned about in his sermons. But Parris didn't act immediately. He was a calculating man, always aware of his precarious position. An accusation of witchcraft was serious, potentially dangerous to the accuser if it couldn't be proven. He needed to be certain. He needed to wait for the right moment. That moment came in late January, when Betty Parris began to have fits. They started as screaming nightmares that woke the household. The 9-year-old would sit bolt upright in bed, eyes wide but unseeing, and shriek about flames and demons. Betty seemed not to recognize her own mother. She spoke in a strange voice, sometimes crying out words that made no sense, sometimes going rigid and silent for minutes at a time. The fits progressed quickly. Soon she was having episodes during the day, crying out in pain, contorting her body into strange positions, suddenly freezing mid-task, and staring at something no one else could see. She complained of being pricked by invisible needles, of pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. She tried to throw herself into the fire. The village doctor, William Griggs, was called. He was an elderly man with limited medical knowledge, trained through apprenticeship rather than formal education. He examined Betty thoroughly, found nothing physically wrong, pulse strong, color good, no signs of illness, yet clearly something was terribly wrong. After several visits, Dr. Griggs spoke the words that would doom Salem. The evil hand is upon her. In the medical understanding of the time, this was a diagnosis of last resort. When no natural cause could be found for an illness involving strange behaviors and convulsions, supernatural causes were considered. The diagnosis spread through the village like wildfire. The minister's daughter was bewitched. Satan had struck at the heart of the godly community. If the minister's own household wasn't safe, no one was. Within days, Abigail Williams began displaying similar symptoms, fits during which she screamed and convulsed, claims of seeing specters, attempts to run up the chimney. Then Ann Putnam began having fits, then Elizabeth Hubbard, then Mary Walcott. The affliction spread among the girls who had gathered in Tituba's circle, each developing similar symptoms. They experienced sudden fits of screaming and convulsing, periods of rigid paralysis, sensations of being pricked or bitten by invisible forces, visions of specters that others couldn't see, speaking in strange voices, attempting dangerous acts. The symptoms were remarkably consistent across all the afflicted girls. Modern medical historians have proposed various explanations: ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, encephalitis, epilepsy, mass hysteria, or simply fraud. But in February 1692, there was only one explanation that made sense to the villagers: witchcraft. The village erupted into panic. Reverend Parris preached sermons about Satan's assault on the godly, about the need to root out the witches who had made a covenant with the devil. The Putnam family demanded action, but there was a problem: the afflicted girls couldn't or wouldn't name their tormentors. When asked, they would cry out in pain, claiming the witches were choking them to prevent them from speaking. This went on for weeks, building tension throughout the community. Behind the scenes, pressure was building on the girls to name names. Their families questioned them repeatedly. Parris interrogated Betty and Abigail for hours. The village leaders made it clear that the crisis couldn't be resolved until the witches were identified. The girls were the only ones who could see the specters. The entire community was depending on them. By late February, the girls were ready to name names, and the names they chose were not random. On February 25, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for 3 women: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Each had been carefully selected for maximum vulnerability. Sarah Good was perhaps 40 years old, but looked older. Once from a respectable family, her father's suicide and subsequent legal battles had left her impoverished. Her 2 husbands had left her with nothing. She and her latest husband William were homeless, moving from place to place, sleeping in barns, begging for food and shelter. She had a sharp tongue and cursed those who refused her charity. She smoked a pipe, unusual for a woman. She had given birth to a baby girl just months earlier, and the infant was sickly. Sarah was exactly the kind of person Puritans associated with witchcraft: poor, angry, disreputable, living on the margins. Sarah Osborne was in her late 50s, and bedridden with illness. She had scandalized the community years earlier by living with her second husband before marrying him. She was involved in a land dispute with the Putnam family and rarely attended church. Like Sarah Good, she was already marked as difficult. And then there was Tituba, enslaved, dark-skinned, foreign, known to have knowledge of herbs and Caribbean practices. Legally powerless, with no family to defend her, and no standing to refuse anything demanded of her. But Tituba was also the key. The Putnam family knew about the kitchen sessions. They knew she had been teaching the girls practices that could be interpreted as witchcraft. They knew she was vulnerable, and they knew that if they could get her to confess, it would validate everything: the girls' afflictions, the existence of a witchcraft conspiracy, the need for aggressive prosecution. What they didn't know was that Tituba had already made a choice. She had watched the girl's afflictions spread. She had heard the whispers. She had felt the net closing around her. She knew she would be accused, and she had decided exactly how she would respond. The preliminary examinations took place in the Salem Village meeting house on March 1st. The building was packed. Nearly every villager had come to witness the spectacle. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin had traveled from Salem town to conduct the proceedings. Hathorne was a wealthy merchant and politician, deeply convinced of the reality of witchcraft and the need to prosecute it aggressively. He would conduct the examinations not as neutral inquiries, but as prosecutions, assuming guilt and demanding confession. The afflicted girls sat in prominent places, surrounded by family members. They ranged in age from 9 to 19. But in that moment, they held more power than anyone else in the room. Their words would determine who lived and who died. Sarah Good was questioned first. She denied everything with sullen defiance, but the afflicted girls writhed and screamed, claiming her specter tormented them even as she stood in the meeting house. Her own husband William testified that he feared she either was a witch or would be one very quickly. After hours of interrogation, she was led away in chains. Sarah Osborne was next. Elderly, bedridden with illness, brought in on a chair. She denied everything, but the magistrate introduced what would become the central horror of the trials: spectral evidence. The idea that a witch's specter could leave her body and torment people while she herself was elsewhere. An alibi meant nothing if your ghostly form could act independently. Sarah made a fatal mistake by mentioning she had once been frightened by a thing like an Indian all black in a dream. She had admitted to supernatural experiences. That was enough. She was dragged away weeping. Then they brought in Tituba. She stood before the magistrates, a dark-skinned woman in a plain grey dress, her eyes downcast. Reverend Parris sat in the front row, his face rigid. He had beaten her the night before, she would later testify, demanding to know what she had done to his daughter. The welts on her back throbbed with each breath. She knew what they wanted from her. More importantly, she knew what they needed. The meeting house fell silent. Everyone leaned forward. Magistrate Hathorne asked the first question. Tituba, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? She raised her eyes and met his gaze directly. For a moment she said nothing. Then in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the packed meeting house, she spoke. The devil came to me and bid me serve him. The meeting house erupted. Gasps, cries, people calling out to God. This was the first confession. After hours of denials from the other two women, here was confirmation that witchcraft truly walked among them. Here was proof that the girls' afflictions were real. The devil was indeed operating in Salem Village. Hathorne leaned forward, eager. Who have you seen with the devil? And Tituba began to speak. She described a tall man from Boston, dressed all in black, who came to her and demanded she sign his book in blood. He appeared to her sometimes as a man, sometimes as a dog, sometimes as a hog. He showed her a book with 9 names written in it, though she couldn't read most of them. She saw Sarah Good's name there, and Sarah Osborne's. There were others too, but she didn't know who they were. The magistrate asked what the devil promised her, if she would serve him. He said he would give me many fine things. Tituba replied. He wanted me to hurt the children, and then, as tears streamed down her face, he made me hurt them. I tried not to, but he was too powerful. He hurt me when I refused. She showed marks on her arms, bruises that could have been from anything, which she claimed were from the devil's punishments. The magistrates questioned her for hours that first day, then a second day, then a third. Each session drew larger crowds. People traveled from surrounding towns to hear Tituba's testimony. She became the star witness, the one who could reveal the full extent of the conspiracy. And with each telling, her testimony expanded. She described a yellow bird the devil gave her as a familiar spirit, a black dog that appeared to her and demanded she serve him, a red cat and a black cat that were also familiars. Midnight rides through the air to witch meetings, a white-haired woman and a tall man with white hair, who were also witches. though she didn't know their names. The Devil's Book with 9 names in it, suggesting 9 witches operating in the area. She wept frequently during her testimony, insisting she had been forced into the devil's service against her will. She begged forgiveness, said she would tell everything she knew if it would help catch the other witches. It was brilliant in its way. Every detail she provided was vivid enough to seem true, but vague enough to be unverifiable. She gave the magistrates exactly what they craved, not just a confession, but proof of a vast conspiracy. But here's the detail that historians have consistently overlooked, the detail that changes everything about how you understand what Tituba was doing. She was describing real people. When she spoke of the tall man from Boston, certain families exchanged glances. When she mentioned the woman with white hair, whispers rippled through certain sections of the crowd. Tituba was settling accounts. Consider what she was doing. She was an enslaved woman with no legal rights, no property, no power. She had been beaten, threatened, accused of a crime that carried the death penalty. She could have simply denied everything, like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, but she had seen what happened to them. Their denials were ignored, they were assumed guilty anyway, and they would likely be executed. So instead Tituba confessed, but she confessed strategically. She gave the magistrates a story that confirmed their beliefs about witchcraft, while also implicating people who had harmed her, or whom she had reason to resent. The tall man from Boston could fit any number of merchants or officials who had visited Parris's household. The white-haired woman could be Sarah Osborne, yes, but also resembled other women who had treated Tituba poorly. She was painting her accusations in broad strokes, allowing others to fill in specific faces based on their own grievances. And it worked. Over the coming months, as more people were accused, many matched descriptions Tituba had provided. She had given Salem a template for identifying witches, and the villagers used it enthusiastically. She had opened a door and let Salem's own darkness pour through it. The resentments, the land disputes, the religious paranoia, all of it dressed up in tales of devil worship and spectral torment. On the 3rd day of her examination, Hathorne made a crucial decision. Tituba's confession was too valuable to waste on a trial. She would be held as a witness against other suspects. Tituba was led away to jail. She had saved her own life through her words, at least temporarily. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne would both die. Tituba would survive because she had given Salem what it needed, not just a witch but a doorway into a hidden world of evil. The problem was that once opened, the doorway couldn't be closed. March bled into April, and the accusations multiplied like a plague. The names chosen revealed the true nature of what was happening. Martha Corey was accused first among the respectable, a full church member known for her piety. She had made the mistake of expressing skepticism, suggesting the girls might be faking. The logic was circular and inescapable. Only a witch would question the reality of witchcraft. When she was brought in, the afflicted girls mimicked her every movement. When she shifted her weight, they shifted theirs. When she bit her lip, they cried out that they were being bitten. Logic had no place in these proceedings. She was sent to jail. Rebecca Nurse was next. This was the most shocking accusation yet. She was 71 years old, a grandmother so devout she was respected across the community, hard of hearing and physically frail. But her family had been involved in a land dispute with the Putnams, and the witch hunt offered perfect cover for old grievances. Ann Putnam Jr. was the primary accuser. Her mother accused Rebecca of murdering her infant children through witchcraft, attributing natural colonial-era deaths to supernatural malevolence. The old woman stood confused and frightened before the court, protesting in a weak voice, "I can say before my eternal Father I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." God did not clear her innocency. Her arrest sent a clear message. No one was safe. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who questioned the proceedings became suspect. By the end of March, over a dozen people had been accused. By April, over 30. The jails were overflowing with prisoners, kept in heavy iron shackles in dark, filthy cells, forced to pay fees for their own imprisonment. Sarah Good gave birth in jail, manacled. The infant died within days. Her 4-year-old daughter Dorcas was arrested, kept in chains so heavy she could barely move, damaged in ways that would never fully heal. Behind the public spectacle, the Putnam family drove everything. Ann Putnam Jr. would eventually accuse 62 people, more than any other accuser. Nearly everyone had some connection to the Putnam family's grievances. People who had won land disputes against them, families who opposed Parris, those who had questioned Putnam influence. But Ann Jr. was a child. Someone was guiding her accusations, providing names, describing old resentments in language a 12-year-old transformed into visions. That someone was her mother, who began having afflictions in March, giving adult credibility to everything. The Putnam women, mother and daughter, became the twin engines driving the witch hunt forward. The magistrates investigated nothing, verified nothing. Spectral evidence became sufficient for arrest and trial. In May, a new governor arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Sir William Phipps found his province in chaos, jails overflowing, no legal framework for trials. He quickly established a special court of oyer and terminer. William Stoughton, the lieutenant governor, served as chief justice, a hardliner, absolutely certain that Satan had established a kingdom in Massachusetts, and determined to destroy it. The crucial question was, what evidence would be admissible? The cases relied primarily on spectral evidence, testimony from afflicted persons, that they had seen the accused specter tormenting them. The problem was obvious, completely subjective, impossible to verify. If someone claimed to see your ghost attacking them, how could you prove they hadn't? Several Boston ministers wrote urging caution, pointing out that the devil might appear in the shape of innocent people. But the judges allowed spectral evidence anyway, reasoning that God wouldn't permit the devil to appear in the shape of truly innocent people. Therefore, any specter seen tormenting the afflicted must belong to a real witch. This decision sealed the fate of everyone accused. The girls' visions became the primary evidence, and the girls, realizing the power they held, used it freely. The first trial was held on June 2, 1692. Bridget Bishop stood before the court, about 60 years old, a tavern keeper known for colorful dress and a sharp tongue. She had been married 3 times. Her tavern was a place where people drank and played games, activities the more strict Puritans frowned upon. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, though the charges had been dropped. The evidence against her this time included spectral testimony, claims that she had appeared to neighbors in spectral form, the discovery of poppets supposedly found in the walls of her house, and claims she had a preternatural mark on her body where familiar spirits could feed. The trial lasted 1 day. The jury deliberated briefly. Guilty. Bridget Bishop was hanged on June 10, 1692, on a rocky outcrop that would become known as Gallows Hill. She was the first execution of the Salem Witch Trials, but she would not be the last. After Bridget's execution, one of the judges, Nathaniel Saltonstall, resigned from the court, disturbed by the proceedings and the reliance on spectral evidence, but he was quickly replaced, and the trials continued. The next session was held in late June. 5 women were tried and convicted: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Rebecca Nurse's trial was particularly controversial. 39 community members signed a petition declaring her innocence. The jury initially returned a not guilty verdict, but Chief Justice Stoughton sent them back to reconsider. Under pressure, they changed it to guilty. Governor Phipps granted a reprieve, then rescinded it when the afflicted girls had renewed fits. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old and pious to the end, was condemned to hang. Sarah Good went to her death cursing Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who stood at the gallows urging her to confess. "You are a liar," she shouted. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." According to legend, Noyes died years later of a hemorrhage, choking on his own blood. The 5 women were hanged together on July 19, 1692. The condemned made to climb a ladder, nooses placed around their necks, then the ladder removed. They died slowly of strangulation, their bodies convulsing as they suffocated. The crowd watched every moment. Afterward, the bodies were buried in shallow graves. Witches didn't deserve consecrated ground. But Rebecca Nurse's family defied this order. Under cover of darkness, they retrieved her body and buried it secretly on their property, marking it with a small stone to prevent authorities from disturbing the grave. August brought more trials and more executions. On August 19th, 5 more people were hanged: George Burroughs, John Proctor, John Willard, George Jacobs Sr., and Martha Carrier. George Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village, accused of being the ringleader of the witches. The evidence against him was thin. He was unusually strong for his size, supposedly lifting heavy barrels with ease, which was taken as proof of supernatural strength. At the gallows, Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, causing murmuring in the crowd. Folklore held that witches couldn't do this. But Cotton Mather, the influential Boston minister, addressed the crowd from horseback and assured them the devil could appear as an angel of light. The execution proceeded. John Proctor had been a vocal opponent of the trials, calling the afflicted girls frauds. His outspoken opposition made him a target. His wife Elizabeth was also convicted but survived in jail because she was pregnant. Execution of pregnant women was forbidden. John Willard had been a deputy constable who became disturbed by the flimsy evidence and refused to make more arrests. Shortly after, he himself was accused. The message was unmistakable: you were either with the witch hunt or against it. George Jacobs Sr. was 80 years old, so frail he needed 2 canes to walk. His own granddaughter testified against him, later recanting that she had been coerced into lying, but by then it was too late. Martha Carrier's own children were arrested and tortured until they testified against their mother. September brought the final executions. On September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged: Mary Easty, Martha Corey, Ann Pudatier, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott. Mary Easty was Rebecca Nurse's sister. She had actually been released briefly after her initial arrest, but then the afflicted girls had renewed fits and she was rearrested. She wrote a petition to the judges that stands as one of the most eloquent documents from the entire trials. She didn't beg for her own life, because she knew her appointed time was set. She begged instead that no more innocent blood be shed. She asked the judges to examine the afflicted girls strictly, to keep them apart, and test whether their stories remained consistent, to scrutinize the confessions that had been obtained through coercion and torture. But her petition was ignored. She was hanged with the others. Martha Corey went to her death still maintaining her innocence. Her husband Giles had already died in a manner that defies description. Giles Corey, Martha's 80-year-old husband, had turned against the trials when his wife was accused, and was soon accused himself. But Giles refused to enter a plea. Under English law, a person who refused to plead couldn't be tried, and if he wasn't tried, his property couldn't be confiscated. He was protecting his son's inheritance. The authorities responded with peine forte dure. Giles was laid on the ground while heavy stones were piled on his chest one by one. For 2 days he lay under increasing weight, ribs cracking, breath failing. Each time the sheriff asked him to plead, his only response was more weight. He died crushed, never having entered a plea. His property passed to his sons. By the end of September, 19 people had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in prison. Dozens more awaited trial. Families were destroyed. The community was traumatized. And through it all, Tituba sat in her cell. The magistrates had lost interest in her. As more exciting suspects emerged, they had her confession on record. They didn't need her testimony for subsequent trials. Her detailed confession had served its purpose. It had validated the existence of a witchcraft conspiracy and provided a framework for understanding the afflictions. Once that framework was established, Tituba herself became irrelevant, and Reverend Parris, who legally owned her, refused to pay her prison fees. In the bizarre accounting of the time, an accused person had to pay for their imprisonment, a fee for each day in jail, for the chains, for the food, even for the arrest warrant. Parris's refusal to pay was effectively abandoning her. He could have paid the fees and retrieved his property, but he chose not to. Perhaps he couldn't afford it. Perhaps he was ashamed, embarrassed, that his own enslaved woman had been the first to confess to witchcraft. Or perhaps he simply wanted to forget she existed, to erase this reminder of how the whole nightmare had started. In the dim jail cell, Tituba listened. She heard the stories of other accused women, their protests of innocence, their confusion about who had accused them and why. A picture emerged in those whispered conversations. The accusations followed a pattern of property disputes, family rivalries, and petty grudges, elevated to cosmic significance. Rebecca Nurse's family had been in land disputes with the Putnams. John Proctor had publicly called the afflicted girls frauds. Martha Corey had questioned the proceedings. George Burroughs had left Salem Village years earlier, under contentious circumstances. Each accusation could be traced to some mundane conflict, now recast as spiritual warfare. Tituba understood because she had initiated this pattern. Her testimony had been strategic from the beginning. The tall man from Boston she described wore clothes similar to those worn by wealthy merchants who had on occasion visited Reverend Parris before he moved to Salem Village, men involved in business disputes with him. She had weaponized the magistrates' fears and the community's paranoia, and it had worked beyond her darkest imaginings. Meanwhile, the trials were beginning to collapse under their own weight. The problem was that the accusations kept expanding. Too many people had been accused, including increasingly prominent citizens. Wives of merchants were named. Ministers' relatives were accused. Even Governor Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was cried out upon by the afflicted girls. This was a turning point. When the accusations reached the very top of colonial society, the men in power suddenly became much more skeptical. The spectral evidence that had seemed so convincing when applied to marginal figures like Sarah Good or Rebecca Nurse appeared dangerously unreliable when it threatened the governor's wife. If anyone could be accused based solely on visions and dreams, then no one was safe. Several of the confessed witches had also begun to recant. Margaret Jacobs, who had testified against her grandfather, publicly admitted she had been forced to lie. She wrote, "They told me, if I would not confess I should be put down into the dungeon and would be hanged, but if I would confess I should save my life." The confessions, taken as proof of the conspiracy's reality, were revealed as products of torture and fear. If the confessions were false, what did that say about the entire proceedings? In October, Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most influential ministers in the colony, published a treatise questioning the use of spectral evidence. His most famous line would be quoted for centuries: "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person be condemned." This was endorsed by 14 other prominent ministers. The message was clear. The trials had gone too far. The methods were unreliable. Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29, 1692. A new superior court was established with strict rules about evidence. Spectral testimony was no longer sufficient for conviction. Confessions obtained through coercion were inadmissible. Physical evidence was required. Of 52 people tried under the new rules, only 3 were convicted, and Phipps quickly pardoned them. By May 1693, all remaining accused persons had been released or pardoned. The witch hunt was over. The final toll: 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 dead in prison, over 200 accused, dozens of families destroyed, a community traumatized for generations. Except for Tituba, she remained in jail because Reverend Parris refused to pay her prison fees. Months passed. The other prisoners went home to rebuild shattered lives. Tituba stayed, through the winter of 1693, into spring through summer. Parris made no move to retrieve her. He had left her to rot. The conditions of her continued imprisonment were harsh. She was alone now, kept in chains in a cold, dark cell. Minimal food, no visitors, forgotten by everyone except the jailer, who charged daily fees for her imprisonment. Then in April 1693, 13 months after her arrest, an unknown person paid Tituba's prison fees. The amount was £7, a substantial sum equivalent to several months' wages for a laborer. The jail records note only "paid in full," with no name attached. Tituba was released, and immediately sold to a new owner to satisfy the debt. The transaction was recorded in a single line of a ledger. Tituba, Indian woman, sold to. Then Tituba vanished from all historical documents. No record of her subsequent life exists. No death notice. No property transfer. No mention in anyone's diary or letter. The woman whose confession had ignited the most infamous witch hunt in American history disappeared as if she had never been, and this disappearance so total, so complete, was not an accident. This is where the story gets dark in a different way. The official narrative of Salem took shape quickly after the trials ended. It was a mistake, the authorities claimed, a tragic delusion, perhaps caused by fraud or mass hysteria, exploited by scheming accusers. The judges issued formal apologies, though they were careful to say they had acted in good faith based on the evidence presented. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, made a public confession of error in 1697, standing in church while his apology was read aloud. He was the only judge to do so. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice who had been the driving force behind the executions, never apologized and maintained until his death that the trials had been justified. The afflicted girls largely remained silent as they grew older. Most married and lived quiet lives. Ann Putnam Jr. apologized publicly in 1706, her confession carefully worded to accept blame while denying agency. She had been deluded by Satan, she claimed, carefully avoiding naming anyone who might have influenced her accusations. She died young and unmarried in 1715. Reverend Parris was forced out of Salem Village in 1697, blamed by many for creating the atmosphere that made the witch hunt possible. His niece Abigail Williams disappeared from records around the same time. No grave, no death notice. The executed were eventually exonerated, though it took decades. 1702 for the trials to be declared unlawful, 1711 for meager restitution payments, 1957 for formal pardons, 2001 for the last 5 victims to be officially exonerated by name. Over 3 centuries to acknowledge what everyone quietly knew. But Tituba was never exonerated, because she had never been convicted. Her confession had saved her from trial, then condemned her to obscurity. Later historians debated her role endlessly. Victim, true believer, fraud. The truth was likely all of these and more. She had been stolen from her homeland, enslaved, dragged across the ocean to a frozen land where she was isolated and abused. When Parris beat her and demanded to know what she had done to his daughter, she had a choice: deny everything and likely be executed like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, or confess strategically and survive. She chose survival. But then there are the documents, and this is where the story shifts from tragedy into something else entirely. In 1957, something strange happened in the Massachusetts archives. A historian named Marion Starkey was researching the Salem trials when she opened a folder labeled simply Salem Miscellaneous. Inside were the original transcripts of Tituba's examination, not the polished versions printed in the early 1700s. The raw court notes, crossed out lines, marginal scribbles, sections deliberately struck through. What she found should have changed how we understand Salem, because Tituba's confession had been edited, not summarized, not simplified, edited. Entire passages were removed before publication, references to specific Boston merchants deleted, descriptions of prominent families cut, and most disturbingly, an entire section describing a visit to the Parris household before the trials even began. According to Starkey's notes, Tituba testified that gentlemen in fine clothes from Salem town had come to the parsonage in late 1691. Before the girls' fits, before the accusations, she said she overheard a private conversation between one of those men and Reverend Parris. They discussed the problem of the village. They named families, families who would later be accused, families who opposed Parris, families connected to land disputes. In her deleted testimony, Tituba implied that this man had essentially handed Parris a list, and when she later described a tall man from Boston serving the devil, it may not have been imagination, it may have been recognition. That section never appeared in the official record. It was removed. Starkey published hints of these discrepancies. Then the documents disappeared again, returned the archive's claim to a private collection. No historian has examined them since. And Starkey herself became reluctant to discuss the deleted passages. When asked later in life, she changed the subject. So ask yourself, why edit a witch's confession? Why remove specific names? Why strike entire sections? Unless those sections pointed somewhere dangerous. Now look at the timeline. Tituba came to Salem in 1689 with Samuel Parris. Before that she lived in Barbados. And Barbados in the 1680s was not just a sugar island. It was a financial hub, a center of the British slave economy, a crossroads of smuggling, private trade and merchant networks stretching straight into Boston. Samuel Parris had failed there. But he would have known the right men, the merchants, the investors, the ones whose fortunes depended on silence. And enslaved people were invisible in the most dangerous way. Masters spoke freely in front of them. Business deals, political grudges, personal resentments. They assumed no one was listening. But what if someone was? What if Tituba heard names in Barbados and heard them again in Salem? What if the tall man from Boston wasn't symbolic at all? What if he was real? When she stood in that meeting house in 1692 and described him in black clothing, carrying a book of names, was she inventing a demon or disguising a memory? Because here's what we know. The moment she confessed, she survived. The moment she gave them a conspiracy, the trials escalated. And the moment her usefulness ended, she was abandoned. 13 months later, someone paid her jail fees. £7. A significant sum. The record lists no name. She was sold, and then she vanished. No bill of sale, no death record, no church entry, nothing. In a colony obsessed with documentation, she disappears completely. That isn't neglect, that's erasure. And the timing matters. The trials collapsed, when accusations reached too high, when the governor's wife was named, when merchants' families were whispered about, when powerful men realized the fire might spread upward. Suddenly, spectral evidence was unreliable. Suddenly, caution was necessary. Suddenly, the hysteria was a mistake. But Tituba, the woman who introduced the conspiracy, the woman whose testimony hinted at elite involvement, she remained in jail until someone ensured she didn't. Now consider the stories that followed. A Caribbean woman appearing in Portsmouth years later, a merchant's diary describing a strange encounter at the docks, a locked coffin for an enslaved woman who supposedly posed no threat. None of it provable, all of it unsettling. Maybe she lived quietly somewhere else. Maybe she died anonymously, like thousands of enslaved people whose stories were never recorded. Or maybe, and this is the part that makes powerful families uncomfortable, she was silenced because she knew too much, because her testimony, unedited, would have suggested something far more dangerous than hysteria. It would have suggested orchestration, and that changes everything. Salem is taught as mass delusion, as superstition gone wild, as a lesson in panic. But what if panic was useful? What if accusations served political ends? What if fear redirected grievances? Land disputes settled, rivals removed, opposition neutralized, and at the center of it all stood an enslaved woman who understood the rules better than anyone else in the room. She gave them what they wanted, but she may have also revealed what they feared, and that is why her story ends in silence, not because it was unimportant, but because it was dangerous. 300 years later, we can name the judges, we can name the victims, we can locate the gallows, but we cannot find Tituba, and that absence is the loudest detail of all. So ask yourself one final question. If Tituba's full testimony had never been edited, if those names had remained, if those gentlemen in fine clothes had been identified, would we still call Salem hysteria, or would we call it something else? Let me know what you think. Was she erased to protect powerful families, or was she simply another enslaved woman lost to history? Because sometimes the most important part of a story is what's missing.